Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a housing association that won't let me into my house. I had one of the most bizarre days of my entire life when I discovered my own property, my secluded, forested getaway, was being held hostage by a self-important homeowners association. Honestly, I never expected to find myself at odds with a group that wasn't even supposed to have jurisdiction over my land in the first place. But that's exactly where I ended up. The entire ordeal began innocently enough with my usual weekend plans. I was on my way to my rustic, century-old cabin, nestled among towering pines and cozy clearings. It was the place I'd inherited from my grandfather, who had built part of it by hand, adding on from the original structure that dated back to his father. As I meandered up the old road, the last thing I anticipated was a blockade of uniformed signs and belligerent people stopping me from entering the long gravel driveway that led to my land. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up slightly. My property is located in a lightly populated county, just on the edge of a large forest. It's not exactly near a suburban area, but there are a few small neighborhoods creeping in from the south where new developments have been sprouting up. About 6 years ago, I noticed how quickly that small cluster of homes had grown into a large and fancy neighborhood. It came with its own homeowners association, presumably because the developer wanted to maintain a certain aesthetic and upkeep. My property was never included in their official boundaries. It's off a private, older road on a separate strip of land that's been in my family for decades. No one in my family ever signed anything or sold any portion of our place to that neighborhood's developer. One might guess that meant I'd be safe from their policy lists, meeting agendas, and mountains of petty bylaws. Unfortunately, that assumption was entirely wrong. The day I rolled up and found them blocking my driveway gate, I realized these folks had made an executive decision. They wanted access to my property for some so-called community improvements, and to finalize that, they'd decided to claim my driveway for their official walking path system. My land is filled with towering birch and pine trees, and apparently, the HOA bigwigs dreamed of a nature trail that extended into the forest. They were going to make it an attraction point for new families in the subdivision. It came complete with signage, benches, and a planned walkway that led deep into the charming local woodlands. The problem? They never asked me. When I drove up that weekend, I saw the sign hammered into the ground. Future neighborhood trail entrance, members only. My jaw nearly hit the steering wheel. I braked so hard my tires skidded in the loose gravel. There were about 3 or 4 people there. One woman had a clip-on ID badge with the letters HOA coordinator printed in bold. Another man stood behind her, arms folded, glowering at me like I was trespassing on their land. There were a few other people too, apparently neighbors, milling around as though attending some sort of official event. I rolled down my window and tried to speak calmly, though my hands were shaking with confusion. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. The woman, whose name turned out to be Felicia, flipped through a bundle of papers. She said, "We're just beginning preparations to expand our community's recreational area." There was no apology, no sense that this was my property. Instead, she glanced at my car with mild annoyance, as if I were the intruder. I pointed up the driveway to the locked gate that read, "Private property. This belongs to me. I did not give anyone permission to put up signs. I did not authorize any of you to stand around here." At that, Felicia arched an eyebrow and gave me a sweetly condescending smile. "We had a board meeting last month," she explained. "We reached out with a letter stating our intentions to incorporate the adjacent forest into our system. According to the property records, this area is part of a shared easement with our neighborhood." I felt heat rush to my face. "I never received any letter, and I've never heard of that easement," I protested. "It doesn't exist. My family never surrendered or sold any portion of this land." Felicia continued flipping through her documents, her tone turning impatient. "Look," she said, pointing to a roughly drawn map. "This boundary line shows a right-of-way that extends from the corner of your property through to the neighborhood line." I recognized that map. My uncle had a copy of it from decades ago. That line was an old logging road no longer in use, not a public thoroughfare. And anyway, the logging trail was entirely behind my property, accessible off a separate road if you walked a half-mile to the north. Nobody used that logging trail for anything except the occasional local fisher or hiker who had permission from me. Now, apparently, the HOA believed they'd discovered a convenient route to transform into a formal trail for all their members. Instead of letting me through, Felicia and her associates formed a human barrier between me and my cabin's driveway gate. When I realized they wouldn't budge, I tried reasoning with them again. I said, "Look, I'm heading to my cabin. I own the land. Step aside, please." But they were adamant that they had the right to be there. They insisted they were allowed to incorporate the entire path all the way up to my gate. "We have official permission from the county," Felicia claimed. I knew that was nonsense. I was intimately familiar with the county's property records, courtesy of all the times my grandfather had taught me how to protect our land rights. He was proud that after so many years we still had the same plot intact. Nothing about that entire scenario was legal, but they had simply decided they were unstoppable. The immediate problem was not just that they were illegally blocking my driveway. They wanted something from me: open access to my land. My cabin site is about 2 acres inside a forest clearing, and the entire property is about 40 acres total. They believed it was underutilized land that would be beneficial for their community. They were pushing me to sign an agreement that said they could build a nature trail winding from the back of their new subdivision up through the woods near my cabin. They promised they'd keep it tidy, install a few picnic tables, and have volunteers monitor it. In return, they vaguely referenced some compensation options, though they never gave specifics. The entire deal was clearly orchestrated by a few overzealous board members. I got out of my car and marched right up to them. "This is my private driveway," I reminded them. "Step aside now, or I'm calling law enforcement." The man next to Felicia, named Andrew, decided to puff out his chest and claim that the HOA is fully within its rights. I didn't see the point in further argument, so I dialed the non-emergency number for the local sheriff's department. After a few minutes on hold, I got transferred to a dispatcher. I calmly explained the situation. People were trespassing on my property and preventing me from entering. Although the dispatcher sounded a bit surprised, she said she'd send out a deputy when available. It took about 30 minutes before a local deputy arrived, and in that half hour, Felicia and the others just kept piling on the pressure. One couple in the group insisted that I was selfish for withholding land that could be a great resource for the entire community. They believed the forest was public domain, given that it wasn't farmland or a fenced suburb. I tried to explain that not all forested land is public, but logic didn't seem to have any effect on them. When the deputy arrived, I nearly sighed with relief, expecting the situation to get resolved quickly. The deputy, Officer Hill, stepped out of his car, took one look at the cluster of HOA folks, and tried to separate us to get both sides of the story. I showed him my deed documentation and explained how my grandfather had acquired the land. I made it clear that I had never, under any circumstances, consented to letting any neighborhood group convert my driveway or forest into a community nature trail. Felicia, however, insisted on presenting what she called the official map from the developer. She repeated that the county had given them partial approval. Officer Hill studied both sets of documents, frowned, and told the group, "It looks to me like this property belongs to the gentleman here. Unless you have direct permission, you can't be here." At that point, I thought we were free and clear. But Felicia then mentioned a certain county official's name, claiming they had a verbally granted right-of-way, and that the final written agreement was pending. Officer Hill looked uncertain. "That may be a separate civil matter," he told her. "But as it stands, you can't physically block him from entering. If you have concerns about property lines, you can take it up with the county's planning department. Otherwise, all of you need to move aside." Reluctantly, the blockade parted. I was allowed to continue up to my cabin, but not without a heap of dirty looks. Felicia declared as I passed, "We aren't finished here. You'll have to cooperate sooner or later." Andrew even muttered something about calling his own lawyer, but I didn't respond. I was just relieved to finally make it up the long gravel road to my cabin, which was exactly as I'd left it, perched in a serene clearing. My family's name was hand-carved into the doorframe, and the old rocking chairs were still on the front porch. The tension from earlier didn't vanish, though. I felt a knot in my stomach, suspecting the HOA wouldn't let the matter drop easily. I spent the rest of that weekend cleaning up the property and double-checking all the boundary markers. My father had put up no trespassing signs in a ring around the perimeter years ago, primarily to keep out hunters or strangers who might not realize the land was private. Over time, some of the signs got worn down or fell off. I replaced them and hammered in new stakes. I also posted a weatherproof sign at my driveway gate stating, "Private driveway, no public access without written permission." I made sure to add a line about how trespassers would be prosecuted under local trespassing laws. I even installed a new lock on my gate. For a few weeks afterward, I got constant phone calls from strange numbers. Sometimes I picked up, only to hear a voice from the neighborhood board trying to pressure me. They'd say I was holding the entire community hostage because I wouldn't sign over the easement. A man named Carter introduced himself as the HOA president and demanded I meet with him and his legal advisor. I politely, and sometimes not so politely, told them all to stop contacting me. Each time I reiterated that my property was not subject to their bylaws, and they had no right to build on my land. I even reached out to the county's planning department to verify that no official application for a nature trail had been filed. The clerk at the office confirmed that no documents had been submitted. That only strengthened my suspicion that the HOA was bluffing about their verbal permission. All was quiet until a few weeks later, when I returned to my cabin to do some routine maintenance. As I turned the corner onto the main access road, I noticed multiple cars parked in a line. My heart sank when I realized they were blocking my driveway again. This time I saw new signs, larger than before, proclaiming Community Conservation Initiative in Progress. They were hammered around the spot my private gate met the road. I also spotted half a dozen people milling around with clipboards, walkie-talkies, and official-looking orange vests. As soon as my car neared, one man ran up and waved me down as if he were directing traffic, trying to get me to park on the roadside. I rolled down the window and demanded, "What on earth are you doing?" The man introduced himself as Toby, a volunteer from the Community Conservation Committee. He cheerfully explained they were out surveying for the new nature trail. When I told him he was trespassing, he seemed genuinely shocked. "But the HOA told us this was all arranged," Toby said. "They said we were free to start planning the trail." Immediately, I stepped out of my vehicle, noticing how there were different colored flags staked into the ground, presumably marking the route they planned to use. I called out to the group, "Everyone, please listen carefully. This is private property. The HOA has no authority here. You are all trespassing, and if you don't leave right now, I'll have to get the authorities involved." A few volunteers looked worried. Some had obviously been told a false story that the county had agreed to let them do a conservation project. Others, however, seemed less willing to leave. A tall woman with a particularly loud voice shouted that the environment belongs to all of us, and that I was a destructive landowner preventing their noble project. I had no patience for another round of debate. I punched in the number for the local sheriff's department again, this time explaining the situation calmly but firmly. I had nearly a dozen unauthorized people on my driveway. The dispatcher recognized my address from the prior call and said they'd send another deputy. While waiting for help, I tried to talk sense into Toby, the volunteer, explaining that the HOA had misled them. He looked concerned but said, "I don't know who to believe. They gave me a permit number and everything." He showed me a small slip of paper with some random digits on it. It certainly didn't look like any official county permit I'd ever seen. When the deputy arrived, this time it was a different officer named Perez, he immediately started telling people they had to move their vehicles off my driveway. Some complied, while others argued with him. At one point, a few volunteers started making phone calls on their walkie-talkies, presumably to contact the HOA board, or maybe even a lawyer, but the law was on my side. Once Perez confirmed that the property was privately owned by me alone and that no legal documents granted them access, he gave them a final warning. "If you don't leave voluntarily," he said, "you can be cited for trespassing." The group began to disperse, though not without a lot of grumbling and a few accusations of me being anti-community. After everyone cleared out, Officer Perez apologized to me for the disturbance and recommended I file a formal complaint with the sheriff's department, which could lead to charges if the group continued this nonsense. I took his advice that day. I filled out a statement including all the details of how they'd misrepresented having a permit, how they'd hammered signs onto my gate, and how they'd effectively blocked my ability to access my own driveway. The next day, I also scheduled an appointment with a property rights lawyer in town, determined to put an end to the harassment. My hope was that a strongly worded cease and desist letter would scare off the HOA board from taking any further action. The lawyer, Miss Alden, was incredibly helpful. She reviewed my documents, the property deed, the genealogical ownership records, and the old logging road layout. She assured me that I had a rock-solid case. "This is textbook trespassing," she said. She drafted a formal letter addressed to the HOA board, demanding that they immediately cease any attempts to enter my property or claim a right-of-way. It threatened legal action if they continued interfering. That letter was delivered by certified mail, and I received confirmation of receipt. For a few weeks, I heard nothing. It was blissfully quiet. I figured that maybe they'd finally realized the error of their ways and decided to drop their misguided plan. Then I got an unexpected phone call from a distant cousin, Millie, who happened to live in the same county. She worked part-time in a real estate office. She told me she'd overheard a conversation about my property. A land developer had expressed interest in the forest because the HOA told him they had partial rights to build a trail. My cousin was flabbergasted. She asked him for details, and he pulled out some promotional flyer that the HOA had apparently distributed, listing the forest as an expansion zone for the community. The developer was under the impression that my property was on the verge of becoming part of the neighborhood, which he saw as a prime investment opportunity. Hearing that made my blood boil. Not only were they trying to muscle in on my driveway, but they were effectively marketing my property as if it were theirs to develop. Furious, I asked Millie for any additional details. She said the man's name was Jonas, a known developer in the region who had a reputation for flipping wooded lots into fancy cabin communities. He was told by the HOA that everything was nearly in place, that they just needed to finalize a few legal formalities. Millie, suspecting something was off, had intervened and said she believed the land was privately owned by an individual, me, with no connection to the HOA. Jonas seemed shocked and said he would look into the matter further. I called my lawyer again and told her about this new development. She advised me to remain vigilant, suggesting that the HOA might attempt new tactics. She recommended that I consider installing cameras, better lighting around the gate, and possibly even scheduling a formal meeting with the county planning office to register my complaint. I did all of those things. I installed 2 motion-activated cameras near the driveway entrance. I put up a solar-powered floodlight that illuminated the gate area at night. Additionally, I wrote an official letter to the county planning department, attaching my deed and the recent cease and desist, highlighting the HOA's attempts to mislead people into thinking they had the right to develop my land. Several weeks of relative calm followed. I visited my cabin more often, half expecting to see suspicious activity, but it was peaceful, just the soft sounds of wind in the pine trees and the chirping of birds near the small creek running through the property. I started to think maybe the battle was over. Then, one Saturday afternoon, as I was chopping wood behind the cabin, my phone buzzed with a text message from the motion-activated camera feed. It had captured movement near my gate. I looked at the still images and saw a couple individuals wearing what looked like matching polo shirts with some embroidered logo. They had come in a pickup truck, parked near my gate, and were tinkering with something near the chain and padlock. My heart pounded. I grabbed my keys, locked up the cabin, and hopped in my truck. By the time I reached the gate, they were gone, but they had left fresh damage behind. The chain was partially cut, the padlock scratched, and the post where my private property sign was mounted had been knocked sideways, as if they'd tried to remove it. I let out a string of frustrated exclamations, thankfully none too foul, as I tried to keep my language clean, then drove straight to the sheriff's office. This time, I wanted a formal complaint filed for vandalism, along with trespassing. I handed over the camera footage, which clearly showed them messing with the chain. The camera resolution wasn't perfect, but it was decent enough to identify them if they were local. As expected, a deputy told me I'd need to wait until they could investigate further. Meanwhile, I decided to stay at my cabin overnight. I was determined not to let them think I'd abandoned the property. Early the next morning, I was awakened by the crunch of gravel just outside. Through my window, I could see a small group of people gathered at the gate again. One was Felicia. She must have recognized my truck, because she started shouting my name. Curious and annoyed, I stepped outside and walked slowly down the driveway. When she spotted me, she launched into a tirade about how I was endangering the progress of the community. She insisted that the HOA was within days of finalizing the official trail. I barked out a laugh. "That's interesting," I told her, "because the county planning department says no such application exists." Felicia's face flushed red. She then demanded I sign a temporary access agreement so they could proceed with their work, claiming it was in everyone's best interest. I asked her if she was aware that I'd filed a police report for vandalism. At that, she paused, her expression flickering with uncertainty, but she recovered quickly, retorting, "Vandalism? Don't be ridiculous. Maybe you broke your own chain." A wave of anger coursed through me. "I have camera footage," I said. "If I wanted to break my own chain, I wouldn't need to skulk around in a pickup truck wearing a matching polo shirt." She looked taken aback. but continued her attempt at intimidation. She pulled out a thick file folder, which I assumed were more questionable documents that supposedly granted them the right to be there. I pointed to the newly replaced chain and padlock. "You try to break that, and you'll be facing more than just a complaint. I've had enough." She insisted I was making my life more difficult, and that eventually the HOA would have me in court. I shrugged and responded, "Fine, I have no problem going to court. My lawyer is more than ready, and from the looks of it, your documents wouldn't stand a chance under legal scrutiny." She tried to retort, but at that moment the deputy's cruiser pulled up to the entrance. The same officer I'd spoken to the previous day stepped out. He asked Felicia and her group if they had any legitimate reason to be on my driveway. She stammered something about pending approvals, but he calmly told them that if they didn't leave, they could face citations or arrest for criminal trespass. Finally, for the first time, Felicia looked genuinely rattled. She backed off, muttering about how I was so short-sighted. Then she and her group piled into their vehicles and left. I consulted again with my attorney, who insisted we push forward with a formal restraining order against any further encroachments by the HOA. She also recommended I contact the county prosecutor's office, given the repeated violations and potential vandalism. Though these steps took time and money, I felt it was necessary to protect the land that had been in my family for generations. The last straw came a few weeks later, when a large envelope arrived at my home address. Inside were papers labeled easement negotiation, presumably from the HOA's own lawyer. They basically demanded I grant them a permanent easement so they could construct and maintain their trail. I was instructed to sign and return it promptly, or further action might be taken. I read through the entire thing, amazed at their audacity. The wording was highly manipulative, implying that I would be financially liable for any legal costs they incurred if I continued to obstruct their project. They even offered me a small one-time payment for the land usage, a payment so tiny it was almost insulting, barely enough to cover a couple months of property taxes. They probably thought I was desperate or ignorant enough to be bullied, but I had grown up learning from my grandfather how to handle land disputes, and I was absolutely not about to let them walk all over me. So, with my lawyer's guidance, I refused their offer. At that point, my attorney filed a more aggressive countersuit, detailing trespass, vandalism, harassment, and a slew of other grievances. We listed specific incidents with dates, times, and police reports. The effect was immediate. The HOA's attorney, after reviewing our evidence, abruptly shifted tone. Suddenly, they were the ones facing a potential lawsuit for property damage, defamation, given how they'd claimed I was illegally blocking their trail, and repeated trespassing. My lawyer told me that once an HOA is threatened with a legal scenario that could result in significant financial damages, many of them back down because they fear a hefty payout. That's exactly what happened. Their attorney reached out to my lawyer, apologizing for the miscommunication and proposing a settlement where they'd guarantee no further attempts to enter my land or block my driveway. In exchange, they wanted me to drop any claims for damages. I mulled it over. On one hand, I was furious and would have loved to see them held accountable in a big way. On the other hand, I wanted my life back. My property was precious to me, and I just wanted to be left alone. After some consideration, I told my lawyer that I wanted them to pay for the cost of the security camera system and the new chain and padlock, plus the attorney fees I had already incurred. Surprisingly, the HOA agreed in order to avoid a protracted legal battle. They also signed a formal document pledging never to interfere with my property again. If they violated it, I could file for an immediate injunction. After the dust settled, I found out that Felicia had quietly resigned from her role. There were rumors that the board had forced her to step down because her zealous pushing of the nature trail had exposed the HOA to legal liabilities. Andrew, the man who had once puffed out his chest at me, also resigned from the board. A new board president took over, and from what I hear, they're a lot more cautious about claiming land that isn't theirs. The developer who'd been interested in flipping the forest moved on to other projects, apparently realizing there was no easy path to get hold of my land. You'd think that was the end, but there was still some lingering tension. A few neighbors from the subdivision seemed to hold a grudge, believing I was the villain who had robbed them of a community asset. One day I went to a small hardware store in town to pick up some supplies. As I was walking through the aisles, I noticed a man glaring at me. Eventually, he approached, introduced himself as Howard, and said he was from that subdivision. He started accusing me of being against the environment, only caring about myself. I calmly explained that my property was well taken care of, that my family had been preserving those woods for generations. We didn't pollute or clear-cut it. We respected the ecosystem. I told him that if the neighborhood wanted a community trail, they were free to build one on their own property, just not on mine. He stormed off in a huff, but there was a woman behind him who'd listened quietly. She later found me in the parking lot and apologized for Howard's rudeness. She told me many people in the neighborhood had no idea the HOA was trying to forcibly take my land. She expressed relief that I had stood up for myself because it set a precedent that even a homeowners association can't just trample on someone's rights. Over the next few months, I gradually went back to enjoying the cabin in peace. No more random volunteers showing up, no more signage hammered into my driveway. When I happened to talk to some folks at a local diner one morning, I heard that Felicia had tried this kind of scheme in another neighborhood once, convincing homeowners that they had no choice but to comply with her plans. She apparently liked to spin tall tales about official permits. Perhaps this time she picked the wrong target. I have no regrets. It might have cost me some stress, time, and money, but at least my grandfather's legacy remained intact. Now, in a perfect world, I would have loved to develop some small partnership with local conservation groups that actually respect private land rights. My grandfather once said he'd be open to letting 4-H clubs or certain local scouts do supervised nature walks, so long as everyone understood it was at our discretion. The difference is, in that scenario, we'd be the ones deciding the conditions, not an overbearing HOA that thinks it can commandeer someone else's property. I've always believed in finding a balance between preserving nature and respecting legal boundaries. It's also worth sharing a second plot line that took place around the same time, something that also reinforced why I cherished that cabin so dearly. My cousin Angela came to visit me one weekend. She had grown up in the city and only occasionally ventured to the forest. She brought her young son Dylan to see the majestic trees, watch the wildlife, and learn a bit about how our family maintained the land. It was Dylan's first time seeing a forest that wasn't a neatly groomed city park. He was entranced by every bird, every squirrel, and each fallen log covered in moss. We took a quiet walk down the old logging trail, on my property of course, and Dylan asked a million questions. He plucked leaves off different trees and compared them, listened for distinct bird calls, and even tried fishing in the creek, though we never caught anything that day. Friends, thank you. See you soon.